This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds. You might call this the crime and punishment of corporate debt. I want to talk to you about the borrowing that corporations have been doing at a record pace for the last 20 years because it is now collapsing. The COVID 19 combination with a capitalist business cycle crash that we are now living through is making it, to make the story very simple, impossible for corporations to even imagine paying back the vast sums of money that they have been borrowing over the last 20 years. And I should explain that this problem is not just limited to corporations. Toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to use an example of where governments get involved in this mess, and that's because the government of Argentina is now working its way through being unable to pay back one of the largest bundles of loans ever given to any country in the history of the world. But my focus is corporations because that's where the problem begins. Governments have only done what the corporations led the way in doing. Okay, so let's start with explaining briefly why corporations have been borrowing money to beat the band for 20 years. It has to do with capitalism as a system, and more particularly with capitalism's constantly recurring business cycles, crashes, downturns, whatever you want to call them. We've had three in the last 20 years: dot-com crisis in 2000, subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the so-called COVID-19 crisis in 2020. In each of those crises, the desperate anxiety of the government, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat, made very little difference. The desperate fear was that the financial crisis would become a general economic crisis. And across the 20 years, that fear got greater. What do I mean? The 2008 crisis was worse than the 2000 crisis, and the 2020 crisis is worse than both of the previous ones put together. So what in each case the government did was to direct the central bank, in our case the Federal Reserve, to respond by dropping interest rates nearly to zero. In other words, making money extremely cheap to borrow. The Federal Reserve lends it to the banks lend it to the corporations. If you drop the interest rates that the Federal Reserve charges to next to nothing, you make it possible for banks to borrow that money and for very little more reloan it and make up the difference, which is how they become rich and have all those marble offices in the middle of downtown. And the Federal Reserve did that to try to stimulate borrowing, to flood the economy with this cheap money in the hopes that that would prevent or at least reduce the risk of a general collapse. With low interest rates, here's what happened. Every corporation, no matter what its situation, suddenly found itself able to get vast sums of money lent at historically terribly low rates, 1%, 2%, numbers that you had not seen before in a century. So what every corporation's board of directors, that tiny group of people at the top of every business, those who own it, the major shareholders, the board of directors that are elected by those major shareholders, those people are the ones who make the decision to borrow money. And they made those decisions at a record pace, which is even now more of a record than it was last year, which was more of a record than the year before. Borrowing for whatever they felt like. Let me drive that home. Did they want to borrow to build a fancy new headquarters office? They could. Did they want to borrow to pay off dividends to their shareholders? They could, and they did. If they wanted to borrow to buy out a competitor at an inflated price, they could, and they did. The decision to go into debt is made by the people at the top of the corporation. But here comes the punchline. What happens when those borrowings, which mean the company has to pay interest on those loans, even if it's at a low rate, and pay them back slowly? What happens if there's an economic crisis, like the one we're living through, and it becomes difficult for the corporation to pay back the loan? Here's what corporations do. They turn to their workforce and they fire people. That's right. They figure out how many people they can let go so that the money they used to pay in wages and benefits for their workers can be freed up to be used to pay off their debts. Did those workers who have to pay off the debts, did they have any say in incurring those debts? No. Did they have any influence on the terms or conditions of the debts? No. Are they in a position to say, look, you shareholders who contracted for those debts, you're going to have to take a cut in your dividends in order to pay off the debts? Can the workers do that? No. And you know why the answers are always no to those kinds of questions? That's not because your capitalist is a nasty fellow. It's because that's the way the system works. That's what capitalism is. It gives a tiny group of people the power to get you into debt, and then if that doesn't work out, to make you pay the cost of the debts that often should not have been incurred in the first place. And if you think that's outrageous, unfair, unjust, good, it is. But let me finish by telling you that it also happens internationally. This last few days, the Argentina government has negotiated with its lenders to deal with the enormous tens of billions of dollars in debts. Argentina is one of the most indebted countries in the world. Can't rival the United States, but it has heavy debts. So it has negotiated a deal with its private creditors, banks and hedge funds and things like that, and it is about to negotiate another with its public creditors, chiefly the International Monetary Fund. And here we go. How did those debts get contracted? A government, a handful of people at the top working with the biggest bankers and the biggest corporations, arranged for the loans, whether it comes from a bank in New York or it comes from the IMF, it really doesn't matter. Tiny group of people arranged for the loans. Lots of fees were paid to lots of banks to get those loans accomplished. Lots of fingers got themselves on that loan money. Much of it was used by the government for all kinds of purposes that the mass of people didn't even know about, let alone agree to. But now that COVID-19 and the global crash are creating enormous difficulties inside Argentina, as they are in every country, Argentina can't pay back the loans. So what is it the IMF is going to demand? We already know, because they always do. We'll help you out one more time, but you've got to improve your capacity to repay the loan. And how do you do that? You raise taxes on the average person, and you cut back public services provided to the average person. Governments like Argentina have done this in the past, and they're about to do it again. It's the perfect parallel for a corporation having borrowed money for the wrong reason at the wrong time to fill the wrong pockets of the wrong leadership. will now make the average worker pay by firing him or her. It's the perfect parallel to cutting public services and raising taxes. Corporate debt is a scam. It is the way capitalism works, to move wealth in the direction of the few who need it least by squeezing even more out of the many who can afford it least. The system is the problem. This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work.